Hello, my name is Lucas Schreiner, and I am doing prompt two for my project, which is John Gardner has stated that there are only two stories. A man goes on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. Based on our coursework, explore the extent to which this is true. Is intertextuality rigid, or do themes and ideas evolve across time and text? What is intertextuality? Intertextuality has been very important in this class. Many of the texts we have used use intertextuality, whether we know it or not. While ideas sometimes pop into our heads and they are sometimes rigid, they have to come from somewhere, right? Intertextuality is a process of using ideas, quotes, peoples, theme, and whatnot from another text or even real world experiences. Many of the texts we have used have intertextuality and have used it in very unique ways. I believe that intertextuality is not rigid, and the pieces of literature that we have studied prove that point well. Only two types of stories. John Gardner has stated that there are only two stories. A man goes on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. This statement might be true, but it gives the idea that intertextuality is rigid, which I do not believe it to be. This leaves us with a very limited mindset. Why do we not get bored of the same story over and over again if there are only two stories? And also, why has media evolved to the point where it is today if there are only two stories? This is why some stories can be fit into these categories. I do not believe there are only two types of stories. Intertextuality evolves literature. Intertextuality is unique. Media takes a lot of time to evolve, but that evolution is not linear. It does not work like a line on a graph. It is more like a web. It transcends generations, flies across the world, and reaches so many different places and ideas. This is not rigid. During this paper, we will discuss what stories are which story, whether they are a stranger comes to town or a man goes on a journey, and what that means as well. One text I find interesting and contrasts many of the others was the first thing we read this winter, FaceTime by Lori Moore. This text is unique because it plays out exactly like a nonfiction story would. The story is actually entirely fiction. All of the characters are made up as well as their conversations. The reason why this story is so familiar and relatable is because it is a combination of the author's real life experiences of the pandemic and others' experiences of the pandemic as well. And this story was read by someone who was alive back in 2017, they would have no idea what this story would be about, and it would not be meaningful at all. If we also have someone read this story from the future and did not experience the pandemic, they would likely not understand the story either. The intertextuality of the story comes from real life examples, which there are many of. There are many relatable moments with historical figures, stories, real time events like the election, and the story of her grandfather's World War II cold lemonade in a jam jar. I believe this story would be considered a man goes on a journey. First of all, for the granddaughter, who has to experience the last moments of her grandfather's life. And also the grandfather, who goes on a journey of his life. A new text that embodies intertextuality in a different way is a prologue of Saigon. The prologue is a true story about the author, Phuc Tran, who is trying to fit in high school. He is a Vietnamese immigrant and automatically does not fit in with his majority white high school. He gets bullied, and all he wanted to do was fit in and assimilate in his very American, very blue collar Pennsylvania high school. In an attempt to fit in, Tron decides to read. He mentions in his prologue that he found a lifetime reading plan that was a guide on what books every educated American should read. This was Tron's chance to fit in and his reason to start reading. But after reading, he found himself in love with these books. He said in his prologue, I pushed past the shallowness and stupidity of my own motivations. I fell in love with the actual literature and the actual ideas of great literature. Universal themes bond these great works together, and they bound me to their oaky yellow pages like Odysseus lashed out to the mast of the ship. Tron 5. Even in this quote, we have intertextuality, that being from Odysseus and the Odyssey, written by Homer over 2,000 years ago. These books inspired him to write his own books about his own ideas and the ideas that he got from his reading. Do you really think that is rigid? Oklahoma is a poem by Hala A'ala and is a perfect example of Gardner's types of stories. It is a story of a stranger coming to town, very similar to Saigon. However, this is a poem. Hala describes Oklahoma in this poem. Oklahoma is a place that is very diverse and had a rich history, but not necessarily a good one. It is home to many racial injustices and is a place of many natural disasters like tornadoes and dust bowls. My favorite quote of this poem is, before the pickup trucks, the strip malls, the dirt beaten by the Cherokee feet, Osayo Desulgi, rope swung from mule to tent to man. Tornadoes came, the wind rearranged the face of the land like a chessboard. This is before the gold rush, the greed of engines, before white men pressing against brown women, nailing crosses by the river, before slow songs of cotton plantations, the hymns towards God, and the murder dangling like earrings. This is my favorite passage of the poem because it goes through so much of what Oklahoma makes Oklahoma in such a short message. From the Trail of Tears, the tornadoes, the gold mud, from the gold rush, the crosses on the river, from the strip malls, from the beaten up Cherokee, from the way of the land, from the plantations, to God, to the murders. This is a very symbolic poem. The Tempest by Shakespeare is unlike any of the other tests we have gone over. First of all, it was meant to be a playwright and performed in front of an audience. Written in 1611, the literature of this time was not very vast. The printing press was a brand new invention. Things like Barnes and Noble did not exist. We take it for granted how much great literature of all types we have in this modern era. But back then, fiction was not as abundant as it was today, not even close. That is why people like Shakespeare really pushed the boundaries. He did this through intertextuality. One way he did this was through reading a recent expedition to Bermuda and Montaigne's essay of cannibals. Through this, he created the Tempest. He even named his character Caliban after the word cannibal from Montaigne's essay. This is a very unique way of intertextuality, using a recent event that just happened and an essay that questions the European way of thinking. In The Tempest, the story is a man of Prospero who goes through his own journey. His ideas changed throughout the story, his mindset changed, his revenge changed, and he gives up the power that he once has. This is very unlike his time. No story was made like this around his time, and it inspired many others. Unlike a story like FaceTime, The Tempest is still being produced today. There are still renditions of the play to this very day, and it transcends time. I think that is very unique, and it contrasts many of the other texts that are not so immune to time. Now that everything has already been talked about, literature, intertextuality is not even bound to books or even poems, even playwrights. It's in songs, movies, TV shows, and much more. Any type of media, it exists. There is not a much better example with this song, I Contain Multitudes by Bob Dylan, which was released in his 2020 album. The title and the theme of the song is from Song by Myself 51, a poem made by Walt Whitman back in 1855. I have listened to the song, and even the words sound the same as the poem. The poems have rhythm to it, and I believe Walt Whitman was trying to do that with his poem. Even the poem is called Song of Myself, meaning is meant to be read in a certain way, in a certain tone, in a certain rhythm. It is not meant to be read like a book. It is not meant to be read monotone. I believe Bob Dylan set out to replicate that rhythm in this song. Conclusions about intertextuality and Gardner. Going back to what John Gardner said about there only being two stories. If there were really only two types of stories, then I would have only read two books in my life. And I have read a lot more than two of them. While stories can be compiled in two types of categories, which are a man comes to town and a man goes on a journey, this mindset is very basic and limiting. Intertextuality is not rigid, and all these different examples of stories prove that. From using intertextuality from over 2,000 years ago, like in Saigon from the Odyssey, or Shakespeare using Of Cannibals, an essay about the European mindset of savagery. These types of intertextuality really push the boundaries and evolve literature to things it has never been seen before. People like Shakespeare, Homer, books like Beowulf, these break bounds and they create pieces of literature and media that no one ever saw before. They are proof that in itself, intertextuality is not rigid. It is not, and themes and ideas do evolve across time and text. Thank you.